You say you want change. You say you want peace. You say you're ready to feel lighter, to finally let go. But what if the reason nothing shifts, no matter how hard you try, is because you're still trying to control everything? Not just your schedule or your goals, but your emotions, your reactions, the timing of your healing, the way others see you, even the pace at which clarity is allowed to show up. This is the paradox that Carl Jung warned us about. The more you grip, the less you grow. The more you try to do healing right, the more you delay the very shift you're craving. Because here's the truth, one most people don't want to admit. Control feels smart. Control feels safe. Control gives you the illusion that if you're careful enough, nothing will fall apart. But what if that very grip is the thing keeping you stuck? What if peace doesn't come after you've figured it all out, but only when you finally stop trying to figure it all out? What if real transformation doesn't feel like victory, but like space, quiet, unfamiliar, free? And what if, just maybe, you don't need to control your healing, you just need to get out of its way? Most people don't realize it, but they're not chasing peace, they're chasing control dressed as peace. You light candles, you journal, you meditate, you say the right things, you read all the books, but deep down something still feels tight, heavy, unmoved. It's not because you're not trying hard enough, it's because you're trying too hard to heal the way your mind says it should happen. There's a part of you, quiet, calculating, cautious, that still believes healing has to look a certain way. It has to be structured, predictable, productive. You want peace, but only if it makes sense. You want surrender, but only if you can stay in control while doing it. You want to soften, but without letting anything fall apart. And that part of you is not bad. It's not broken. It's protective. It was born in moments when chaos felt too loud, when vulnerability felt too dangerous. So it stepped in to manage your life, to plan your growth, to calculate your healing. But here's the cost. When control becomes your compass, presence disappears. When you're always managing, preparing, preventing, you're not really here. You're performing awareness. You're performing surrender. You're performing trust. And Jung knew anything we perform too long eventually disconnects us from our soul. This isn't about giving up. It's about stepping out of your own way. So that life, messy, beautiful, unpredictable life, can finally start to move through you again. And if you feel ready to go deeper into understanding yourself, I've placed something special in the pinned comment. It's a short ebook written for people like us who want to understand the human mind, learn how our emotions work, and finally stop being controlled by what we don't even notice. It's not about fixing yourself. It's about understanding what's been running the show from behind the scenes and gently taking your power back. You didn't choose to become controlling. It didn't start because you're obsessive or rigid or high-strung. It started because at some point, life taught you that unpredictability could hurt. Maybe. No one ever said it out loud. But you learned it in how people withdrew when you were too emotional. You learned it in the silence that followed your honesty. You learned it in the chaos you had to navigate without a map. So, you created one. Control became your compass, and the more life threw at you, the tighter you gripped it. You started managing not just your actions, but your emotions, your reactions, your needs. You anticipated everything. You rehearsed your words before saying them. You measured your presence in every room. You called it being responsible, being self-aware, being mature. But underneath all that effort was fear. Fear that if you ever let go, even for a moment, everything would collapse. People would leave. Things would fall apart. You'd lose your grip on the version of yourself the world had learned to accept. Because let's be honest, you didn't build control out of strength. You built it out of survival. Control became the armor that kept you safe when softness felt dangerous. It made you feel powerful when you were powerless. It made you feel prepared when you were drowning in uncertainty. But here's the paradox. The more you rely on control, the less space you leave for real transformation. Because control isn't growth. It's repetition. It's rehearsing life instead of living it. It's managing emotion instead of feeling it. It's narrating your healing instead of surrendering to it. And slowly, without realizing, you begin to lose access to your intuition, that quiet, ancient voice within you. That whispers truths no spreadsheet can calculate. You don't mean to shut it out, but you stop trusting anything that doesn't come with a plan. You ignore signs unless they arrive on schedule. You measure your peace by how productive you've been. You even spiritualize your control, turning every emotion into a lesson, every silence into a test, every discomfort into a failure to stay high vibe. But peace isn't another project. Healing isn't another checklist. And your soul isn't interested in being managed. What it craves is presence, not performance. Not control. Not the illusion of safety that keeps you locked inside your head while life passes by untouched. Jung understood this. The ego's need to control is a defense against the unknown. And the unknown is where the self lives. The deeper, wiser, untamed part of you that doesn't follow rules but follows resonance. And that's what control can't tolerate, the unknown. It wants timelines, it wants guarantees. It wants to be sure before it moves. But life doesn't work that way. Healing doesn't work that way. Transformation only happens when something inside you says, even if I don't know what's next, I'm willing to be here for it. You can't predict your way into peace. You can't strategize your way into wholeness. You can't manage your emotions like a company and expect to feel free. You have to feel them. You have to listen when your body says slow down, even when the world says keep going. You have to allow stillness to be uncomfortable without rushing to fill it. You have to stop explaining your sadness, justifying your joy, editing your humanity. You have to make room for the real, not the curated, not the spiritual, not the performative, but the raw, breathing, imperfect human version of you that doesn't need to be fixed to be worthy. And yes, that's terrifying. Because control gives you the illusion of safety. It tells you that if you're careful enough, alert enough, perfect enough, nothing bad will happen. But what it never tells you is that nothing good can fully happen either, because good things, real things, require openness. They require presence. They require you to be in the moment, not managing the moment. And when you're always managing, you miss it. You miss the silence between breaths. You miss the joy that comes unannounced. You miss the connection that lives inside awkward pauses and unplanned laughter. You miss the version of yourself who could finally breathe without bracing. So let me ask you gently, what if your grip isn't protecting you anymore? What if it's the one thing keeping you from what you actually want? Not more control, but more freedom. Not more progress, but more peace. Not more answers, but more space to ask better questions. And maybe the moment you stop trying to control your healing is the exact moment it finally begins. So you finally let go. You loosen your grip. You stop rehearsing every move and managing every emotion. And then nothing happens. No flash of clarity, no wave of peace, no grand spiritual awakening. Just silence, just stillness, just space. And if you've been gripping for years, that silence doesn't feel peaceful. It feels wrong. It feels like failure. It feels like you're missing something important. Because when control was your safety, stillness feels like danger. When structure was your identity, space feels like identity loss. When managing everything was your way of proving worth, presence feels like you're not doing enough. And this is where most people turn back. They mistake emptiness for regression. They think, if I'm not moving, I must be stuck. So they return to the only thing they trust, control, schedules, fixes, frameworks, performance. But what if that nothing you're feeling now isn't nothing at all? What if it's the first moment your nervous system has had to breathe? In years? What if this is what healing actually looks like? Not progress you can measure, but pressure you've stopped feeding. You're not going backward. You're learning to exist without gripping, without editing, without filling every gap with purpose and productivity. And that's deeply disorienting at first. You start to notice how often you filled space just to avoid discomfort, how often you talked just to avoid silence, how often you over-explained your emotions not to be understood, but to manage how others would perceive you. You realize how much energy you spent not on living, but on controlling how your life looked from the outside. And now that you're no longer chasing control, life feels strange, because you're not quite sure who you are without all that effort. But stay with it, because underneath the confusion, Something ancient begins to stir. You start to notice subtleties you used to miss. Your breath no longer shallow. Your thoughts no longer a storm. Your body no longer rushing to fix every feeling before it fully arrives. And in that space, something unexpected emerges, clarity. Not the kind you force, not the kind you plan for, the kind that arrives on its own because you finally stopped pushing it away. You begin to trust slower rhythms. You stop labeling every discomfort as a setback. You stop translating every emotion into a lesson or warning. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start wondering what's trying to come alive in me. Because maybe the sadness isn't a flaw. Maybe it's a signal that something deep within you is shifting. Not breaking, but rearranging. Maybe the lack of motivation isn't laziness. Maybe it's resistance finally letting go. Maybe the stillness isn't emptiness. Maybe it's peace. Without pressure. This is the moment Jung described when he spoke of the withdrawal of projections. You're no longer projecting control onto the world as your path to safety. You're withdrawing it, and in doing so, meeting yourself more honestly than ever before. But here's the hardest part. No one can walk this part of the path for you. It's quiet, it's slow, it's deeply internal. There's no checklist, no applause, no algorithm rewarding your inner shift, just you and your breath. And the space you used to fear. But something sacred begins to happen when you stop performing healing and start simply allowing it. You sleep better, not because you finally figured out the perfect night routine, but because your mind isn't gripping your day like a battlefield. You speak softer, not because you're unsure, but because you don't need to shout over your own inner resistance. You make decisions from the body, not the ego, because you've stopped outsourcing your intuition to strategy. You no longer demand certainty from the future. You no longer punish yourself for not knowing. You begin to realize that the peace you were chasing didn't live at the top of some mountain. It lived behind the need to climb at all. This is not the kind of peace that comes from everything going your way. It's the kind that comes from no longer needing it to. And strangely, the less you try to make life make sense, the more it begins to feel meaningful. Not because you figured it out, but because you finally gave up the chase. So the next time you feel the urge to grip again, to manage, to fix, to perfect, ask yourself gently, what would happen if I didn't interfere this time? What would happen if I let this feeling, this moment, this silence just be? You might be surprised to find that space isn't the enemy. It's the doorway, and behind it lives everything you've been trying to control your way into without ever needing to. You weren't expecting this. You thought surrender would feel like collapse. You thought letting go would look like chaos. You were prepared to feel lost without your usual grip on everything. But what's actually happening is different. You're not unraveling, you're softening. You're not falling apart. You're falling inward. And the more you allow space, the more life starts to meet you there. Not with grand events, not with fireworks, but with subtle shifts you never noticed before. You wake up and your first thought isn't a to-do list. You pour your coffee and actually taste it. You speak and don't immediately analyze your tone. You start saying no, without writing an emotional essay to justify it. You say yes without calculating what you might owe in return. You allow people to misunderstand you, and you don't chase clarity to feel safe. And that right there is freedom. Not the loud, performative kind. The quiet, internal kind. The kind that whispers, you don't need to explain who you are to feel real. For the first time, your decisions aren't coming from fear of what might go wrong. They're coming from a deep sense of what feels true, even if no one else understands. You stop managing people's expectations. You stop curating your emotional expressions to protect others. You stop turning your presence into a product, and as you shift, the world around you responds. People who only connected with your performance slowly fade, but the ones who stay or arrive feel different. There's no pressure to be perfect, no need to translate your feelings, no urgency to fill silences with surface-level comfort, just space, just breath, just presence. You realize how many of your past interactions weren't really about connection. They were about maintenance, keeping the peace, keeping the image, keeping the rhythm that made others feel safe, even if it left you completely out of sync with yourself. And when that performance drops, you begin to recognize something shocking. You don't feel lonely. You feel real. Because now you're not bending to fit the moment. You're allowing the moment to meet who you actually are. Even your body starts to change, not in appearance, but in rhythm. You move slower, you pause longer, you listen more, not to react, but to receive. Your nervous system begins to trust that it no longer has to be on guard. Not because everything is perfect, but because you've stopped expecting perfection to feel safe. And that's where the real shift happens. You start to live with life, not against it. You no longer obsess over timing. You don't panic when things feel uncertain. You don't grip every decision like it's a moral test. Instead, you feel for what's honest. You respond to what's here. You follow what feels alive, even if it doesn't make sense yet. This is the rhythm of the self. The part of you, Carl Jung said, is whole, even in chaos. The part that doesn't need control to trust. The part that doesn't need clarity to begin. And here's the beauty. You stop trying to become your best self. You start allowing your real self to lead. You no longer feel the need to hustle for progress. You understand that presence is progress, that stillness is movement, that choosing honesty over image is healing. You stop seeking breakthroughs in loud, dramatic moments. You start noticing them in the quiet ones, the breath that lands fully in your chest, the smile that isn't calculated, the decision that feels aligned, even without external approval. You begin to trust yourself again, not because you're doing everything right, but because you're finally listening. You're no longer making choices from panic, you're making them from peace, and for the first time, you don't feel like you're behind. You feel like you're right on time, even if nothing outside has changed, because inside something massive has shifted. You're not forcing, you're allowing, and what you allow starts to grow. Peace no longer feels like a reward. It feels like your natural state. Stillness no longer feels like danger. It feels like home. Uncertainty no longer feels threatening. It feels alive. You're no longer waiting for life to give you permission to exhale. You've taken that breath on your own, and now that you're not willing to give it up again. You thought letting go would be personal, internal, quiet, and in many ways it is. But what no one warns you about is this. When you stop controlling yourself, your relationships begin to change because people were connecting to the version of you that managed everything. The agreeable one, the one who always knew what to say, the one who filtered her words, softened her emotions, calculated her timing. You weren't faking it. You were surviving. But now that you've stopped surviving and started feeling, the mask no longer fits. And suddenly you start noticing how many of your old connections weren't built on truth. They were built on performance. You were there, but not open. You were present, but not reachable. You were emotionally available, but only in ways that felt safe to others. So when the performance ends, the dynamic shifts. You say less, you explain less, you allow more pauses, you stop fixing emotional discomfort the second it shows up in the room, and some people don't know how to hold that. They miss the version of you who smoothed the tension, who filled every silence, who absorbed unspoken expectations like air. Now, when you don't jump in to save the moment, it exposes what was really holding the relationship together, your emotional labor. But here's the thing, that's not rejection, that's clarity. Because when you stop controlling yourself to be lovable, you start to see who actually loves you when you're no longer bending. You stop asking, do they accept me? And start asking, do I feel like myself with them? That's a radical shift, because you're not just giving others access to your presence, you're reclaiming it for yourself. You no longer enter conversations trying to manage outcomes. You no longer shape your truth to keep the mood light. You no longer make yourself digestible just to feel seen. Instead, you show up raw, whole, human, and not everyone knows how to hold that. But the ones who do will never ask you to shrink. Again, they won't flinch at your silence. They won't try to fix your sadness. They won't require constant performance to stay close. They'll recognize the version of you that was hidden beneath all that control and welcome her home. Because here's what you realize. The version of you that was always okay, always. Smiling, always giving. She wasn't real, she was safe, but the version who trembles sometimes, who doesn't have all the answers, who speaks slower, cries mid-sentence and pauses to breathe, she's real, and only by being real. Can you ever truly be loved? You begin to understand that control wasn't protecting your heart. It was isolating it. You weren't keeping others close. You were keeping connection convenient, predictable, unthreatening. But real intimacy? It asks more of you. It asks for your honesty, not your polish, your contradictions, not just your wisdom, your pain, not just your healing. And for that, you need to stop controlling how you're seen, because when you manage how others perceive, you may be understood, but you'll never be felt. Letting go of control means letting go of the need to be perfect in someone else's mind. It means being misunderstood sometimes. It means sitting in the discomfort of not being everyone's favorite version of you. But it also means being loved in ways you never imagined were possible. Not because you got it right, but because you let yourself be real, and that realness becomes a magnet for what's true. You begin attracting people, experiences, conversations that feel alive. You no longer chase resonance, you create it by being honest. And for the first time, your relationships stop draining you because you're no longer editing yourself just to be held. You stop anticipating their reactions. You stop managing their perception. You stop apologizing for your intensity, your silence, your softness, your truth. You simply exist. And that becomes more than enough. So much of your exhaustion wasn't from doing too much. It was from suppressing too much. You weren't tired because life was heavy. You were tired because you carried the burden of being someone else just to feel loved. Now, with the control gone, love becomes something else entirely. Not something you earn. Something you allow, not something you curate. Something you receive, not something you perform. Something you recognize when it finds you. And it will find you, in the quiet spaces, in the moments you didn't rehearse, in the pauses you didn't fill, in the softness you used to hide, because now you're not controlling how you connect, you're simply connecting, and that changes everything. You thought letting go would make life fall apart, but maybe letting go was the only thing holding you together. For so long, control made you feel capable, focused, resilient. You wore it like armor. You called it discipline. You called it strength. You called it doing the work, but now you see it for what it really was. A survival strategy wrapped in self-improvement. You weren't trying to grow. You were trying not to break. You weren't trying to be whole. You were trying to be acceptable. To yourself, to others, to a version of reality that told you you had to earn peace by proving control. But here's what life has been whispering to you all along. You don't need to be in control to be safe. You don't need to be predictable to be loved. You don't need to perform presence to be seen. What you truly need is to be as you are, unpolished, unedited, whole. And in that honesty, something begins to return. You stop analyzing every feeling like it's a problem to be solved. You stop trying to control the outcome of every emotion before it can even be expressed. You stop labeling the silence as failure and start recognizing it as truth. You don't need a lesson in every moment. You don't need a breakthrough in every breath. You don't need a script to be worthy of speaking. You just need to show up. In your timing, in your rhythm, without shrinking, without rushing, and life quietly, gently starts to meet you there. It offers alignment instead of noise, connection instead of performance, softness instead of tension. Not because you figured it out, but because you stopped resisting it. This isn't the end of your healing. This is the end of your interference. The moment you stop managing every part of your transformation is the moment transformation finally becomes possible. And it doesn't happen with force, it happens with space, with surrender, with softness, with the kind of stillness that once felt like failure, but now feels like freedom. You realize peace was never about everything going your way. It was about no longer needing it to. It was about trusting yourself, not as a project in progress, but as a person who's already worthy. And if something in you has shifted as you listened, if even a whisper inside you said, "This is me," then let this be your quiet act of permission, Not for perfection, not for performance, but for presence. Comment the word space below and let it be your reminder. You don't have to keep holding it all together. You don't have to prove your worth with effort. You don't have to control your way into becoming. You're already home. Just breathe. Be here and let life find you.